Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Renu Arora, former Head Education and Training Division, NISCARE CSIR, New Delhi. I am here on behalf of Professor Purnima Kaushik, Head Department of Library and Information Science, University of Rajasthan. Today I am going to cover Module 2, that is Types of Information Sources, Documentary, Primary, Secondary and Tertiary. This is under the paper Information Sources, Systems and Services. In this module, we'll be studying the various documentary sources of information, their characteristics and use in different contexts. The documentary sources are categorized into primary, secondary and tertiary sources of information. We will learn their development and importance in study, research, recreation, and personal development. Let's take a look at objectives of this particular module. After reading this module, you will be able to know the characteristics of information sources. You can identify documentary and non-documentary sources of information. You'll be able to list various types of information sources, know about the primary, secondary and tertiary sources. You can also distinguish between primary, secondary and tertiary sources of information. And lastly, we'll be giving you plenty of examples from various documentary sources of information. The sources from where we get information are called information sources, and these comprise of documents, humans, institutions, as well as mass media like radio, television, and internet. Information sources are significant for information organizations and information users. Information sources are of two types: documentary sources and non-documentary sources. All recorded sources are documentary sources and the non-recorded sources are non-documentary sources. Based on the information content and organizational level, documentary sources are categorized as primary, secondary, and tertiary. Documentary sources are books, periodicals, magazines or reference books and others. Documentary sources are defined as records relating to individuals or group of individuals that have been generated in the course of their daily lives. This is not to say that documentary sources do not require a structured approach. On the contrary, the use of letters, diaries, and the like need a careful methodology in order to extract their relevance for the understanding of society. Documentary sources can be further categorized based on their information contents and physical form as documentary sources by contents, documentary sources by form. These may be published or unpublished, in print or in electronic form. Documentary sources can be categorized as primary, secondary, and tertiary sources on the basis of appearance of information. Categorization of documentary sources of information is based on the information content and organizational level. The documentary sources are usually categorized as primary, secondary, and tertiary. Firstly, the primary sources. Primary sources are those which are published for the very first time. For example, a researcher has published a paper or written notes in his diary or any other standard or patent that has been produced. Secondly, the secondary sources. Anyone who is listing the primary sources of information will be bringing out in the form of secondary sources of information. And lastly, the tertiary sources. Tertiary sources are the third category or the third level, and all the sources that have been published are brought in the tertiary sources. So when we take a look at the categorization of documentary sources, it's a kind of ladder. We begin from primary sources, move on to the secondary sources, and lastly the tertiary sources. The tertiary sources help us to identify secondary sources, and secondary sources lead us to the primary sources of information. Let's now take a look at some examples of primary sources of information. The first example is a periodical publication. A periodical is a publication with a distinctive title which appears at stated or regular intervals without prior decision as to when the last issue shall appear. It contains articles, editorials, features, columns, stories, and other writings by several contributors. Next example is a newspaper. A newspaper is a scheduled publication containing news of current events, informative articles, diverse features, editorials, and advertising. It usually is printed on relatively inexpensive low-grade papers known as the newsprint. A technical report is another example of primary publications. A technical report is defined as a formal report designed to convey technical information in a clear and easily accessible format. It is usually a document written in any field of knowledge by a researcher dealing with the results of a project. A dissertation or thesis is another example, as it is a document submitted in support of an academic degree presenting the author's research and findings. Its purpose is to inform and present scholarly information. This category of documents are usually collected by academic or special libraries as they contain results of original research. Reports and proceedings of a conference provide information about a conference and are also the published form of the papers that were presented at the conference. A patent is the next example, which is an exclusive right granted for an invention, which is a product or a process that provides in general a new way of doing something and offers a new technical solution to a problem. It means to protect the intellectual property rights of an individual. Standards are another example, and which are documents which are prepared by an authority to specify a product, material, process, quality, etc. Initially used first for industrial products, these later began being used by service sector as well. The purpose of these documents is to maintain quality control and efficiency. Trade and product bulletins are information products brought out by publishers, manufacturers, and distributors of various types of materials, products, or services. Secondary sources. Secondary sources analyze, review, or summarize information contained in primary sources or other secondary resources. Even sources presenting facts or descriptions about events are secondary unless they are based on direct participation or observation. Moreover, secondary sources often rely on other secondary sources and standard disciplinary methods to reach results, and they provide the principal source of analysis about primary sources. Secondary sources build on the primary sources with more extensive and in-depth analysis. They summarize, evaluate, and analytically interpret primary material, often by offering a personal perspective. It is thus one step removed from the original source. A secondary source therefore provides second-hand information that has been digested, analyzed, reworded, or interpreted, and often combines information taken from primary sources and even other secondary sources. They are mostly dependent upon primary sources of information for their existence. Secondary sources are often written well after the events they report on and can be put past information into their historical context. In a secondary source, the impressions and experiences of other works are reported. Their main advantage is that they usually present the contents of primary documents in condensed form or list them in a helpful way so that existence of primary documents is known and access to them is made easy. For example, in sciences, a primary source is a journal article where a scientist describes his research work on the subject cloud computing. A secondary source would be a review article commenting on analyzing the various scientists' research on the subject cloud computing. Need for secondary sources. In a secondary source, the impressions and experiences of other works are reported. They are required for most of the research and library professionals, as these firstly present the contents of primary documents in condensed form or list them in a helpful way so that existence of primary documents is known and access to them is made easy. Secondly, help to get expert opinion in order to evaluate what the primary sources really contain. Thirdly, enable to gain insight by examining the same content from different perspectives. Fourthly, assist the researchers to form own opinion. Fifthly, save reading time of users by collecting information from a number of different sources. And lastly, can broaden a user's perspective and research. Let's now look at the category of secondary sources. The first in this category is a book. A book is a document that normally deals with one particular subject having a continuous thought content. Most books have a protective cover. Books are reasonably inexpensive and convenient to store, transport, and find knowledge and information. A reference book is defined as a book, as a dictionary, encyclopedia, atlas, etc., which is intended primarily for consultation rather than for consecutive reading, and also a library book that may be used on the premises but not to be taken out. Secondary periodicals, being another example, are regularly used for scanning the literature published in primary sources, select the relevant items, arrange them in helpful sequence, and bring them to the notice of researchers at regular intervals, which could be weekly, fortnightly, monthly, or quarterly interval basis. These publications contained bibliographical references of each item with or without abstracts. A secondary periodical with abstract is called an abstracting periodical, and without abstract it is referred to as an indexing periodical. Bibliography, being another example, is considered as a secondary source of information as it is a systematic compilation of already produced primary sources of information. While categorizing, the survey publications survey the selected portion of primary literature and provide an overview of the subject or hindsight significant literature on the subject. Tertiary sources are based on primary and secondary sources of information and serve as key to the primary and secondary sources. Tertiary sources are usually compilation from primary or secondary sources and help the researcher to select required primary or secondary source which will be most relevant for his purpose. These publications do not carry subject information but guide the users to the source where information on that subject will be available. Tertiary sources are usually not credited to a particular author. In the order of appearance, first primary sources are published, then based on primary sources, secondary sources are compiled. Tertiary sources are third in the order of appearance, and these sources are based on primary as well as secondary sources and serve as guide to primary as well as secondary sources. Tertiary sources consist of information which is a distillation and collection of primary and secondary sources. Tertiary sources provide overview of topics by synthesizing information gathered from other sources and often provide data in a convenient form or provide information with context by which it interprets it. The information is compiled and digested into factual representation so that it does not obviously reflect points of view, critiques, or persuasions. Tertiary sources are typically the last to be published in the information cycle. Under tertiary sources of information come publications, guides to the reference sources, bibliography of bibliographies, etc. Other examples of tertiary sources are the almanacs, directories, handbooks, guides, manuals, etc. Textbooks are also considered by some information scientists as tertiary sources. Some reference materials and textbooks are considered tertiary sources when their chief purpose is to list, summarize, or simply repackage ideas or other information. As tertiary sources, encyclopedias and textbooks attempt to summarize and consolidate the source materials into an overview, but may also present subjective commentary and analysis, which are characteristics of secondary choices. However, most information scientists categorize textbooks as secondary sources only, and these have been already discussed as part of the secondary sources. Let's now take a look at types of tertiary sources. The first one is almanacs. The present-day almanacs include a comprehensive presentation of statistical and descriptive data covering the entire world. A handbook is defined as a comprehensive and detailed work on a particular topic for practitioners, structured for quick reference and often used as a supplement to a textbook. Handbooks are collection of useful information combining some of the features of both a dictionary and an encyclopedia. Third category, that is manuals. Manual is defined as a document with instructions, especially for operating a machine or learning a subject or performing an operation. The manual is a concise reference handbook dealing with a particular process, procedure, operation, mechanism, job, instruction, etc. Then comes the directory. A directory is a list of names, addresses of people, and organizations. Directories are ready reference tools in the libraries that provide information related to individuals, organizations, institutions, etc. Bibliography of bibliographies also fall under the tertiary sources. It is defined as a type of bibliography which includes information about the various bibliographical aids. It is a list of bibliographies listed in a systematic and logical order. It includes all types of bibliographies published in different fields. The listed bibliographies lead readers to useful bibliographies through various approaches. The guides to literature are also under tertiary sources. These direct the users to appropriate sources in a field of knowledge. In each of the guides to the literature, we can find annotated bibliographies of books, journals, websites, databases, and other types of publications or information sources on specific topics. Then there are guides to reference sources. These enable us to identify the best possible reference sources for research needs. Just like the guides to the literature, these guides cover reference sources in various subject fields arranged in helpful order to enable the user to search the relevant information sources. Union Catalog is also a tertiary source, and it is a catalog which lists the holdings or part of holdings of two or more libraries. It may be local, regional, or national and covers the book collection or periodical holdings of any other part of the collection of the library, and the chief function is to serve as a tool for location of the library materials. Distinction between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Let's now see how primary, secondary, and tertiary sources are different from each other. The distinction between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources can be ambiguous and is not always clear. An individual document may be a primary source in one context and a secondary source in another. Depending on how and why it is being used, a secondary source may also be a primary source. As we have already told you in connection with the primary sources are original material from the time period involved and have not been filtered, influenced, or analyzed through interpretation. They bring us as close to the original event or thought as possible. The secondary sources build on the primary sources with more extensive and in-depth analysis. And lastly, the Tertiary sources are distillation and collection of primary and secondary sources. The distinction of these three sources is presented in the table. Firstly, source. Primary. Primary source is defined as a source that contains raw, original, interpreted, and unevaluated information. Timing of publication cycle. Primary sources tend to come first in the publication cycle. Formats. Primary sources have the following format, that is research paper, preprint, letters, conference papers, diaries, correspondence, fiction, poetry, newspaper articles about current events. Example of a primary source: article in a library and information science journal. Secondly, source secondary. Definition: secondary sources are those that digest, analyze, evaluate, and interpret the information contained within primary sources. They tend to be argumentative. Timing of publication cycle. Secondary sources tend to come second in the publication cycle. Format. The secondary sources are available in the form of indexing periodicals, abstracting periodicals, bibliographies, reference books, etc. Example: library and information science abstracts. Thirdly, tertiary sources. Definition: tertiary sources are those that compile, analyze, and digest secondary sources. They tend to be factual. With regard to timing, tertiary sources are the last in the publication cycle. Regarding the format of tertiary sources, these are in the form of reference books, for example, encyclopedias, directories, bibliography of bibliographies, guides to reference works, etc. An example of a tertiary source is Ulrich Periodicals Directory. In addition to that, there are several other examples from other subjects. For example, in the subject of agriculture, primary source will be conference paper on animal nutrition. Secondary source will be review article on the current state of research in the field of animal nutrition. Tertiary source will be encyclopedia article on animal nutrition. Another example from the subject of chemistry. A chemical patent is a primary source. Chemical abstract service is a secondary source. Table of related reactions is a tertiary source. Example from library science. Primary source is ISO 2709 standard for bibliographic record formats 2009. This is a primary source. Secondary source is progress in librarianship and annual publication. Tertiary source is Walford's Guide to Library Material. An example from subject of physics. Primary source is Einstein's diary. Secondary source is bibliography on Einstein, and tertiary source is bibliography of bibliographies on relativity. Advantages of periodicals. As these are published frequently, periodicals are the best sources for current information. Periodicals often contain information on the latest trends, products, research, and theories. Current events are usually discussed in periodicals long before they become the subject of a book. Periodicals are the best source for ephemeral and very specialized information. Periodicals are portable and easy to handle physically. Periodicals exist for every field and every area of interest, providing access to a variety of hard-to-find information. Due to the shorter length of periodical articles, more topics may be covered within one volume of a periodical than in one book. Periodicals can be scholarly, trade, or popular periodicals. Newspapers. A newspaper is not only a source of information, but it's a storehouse of information. It is a scheduled publication containing news of current events, informative articles, diverse features, editorials, and advertising. It is usually a printed publication on relatively inexpensive, low-grade paper known as the newsprint. It is a publication issued periodically, usually daily or weekly, containing most recent news. Newspapers thus provide an excellent means of keeping well informed on current events. They also play a vital role in shaping of the public opinion. Different library and information science experts think differently about newspapers being primary sources of information. In fact, that it is dependent on contents of the newspaper articles to a large extent. Some newspaper articles are clearly primary sources. For example, a reporter's account of an event that he or she witnessed firsthand. For example, a natural phenomena like an eclipse is a primary source. Similarly, an opinion piece or a letter to the editor in a newspaper is primary source. However, some newspaper articles could be secondary sources. Most newspaper stories are written by reporters or special correspondents who have gathered information from witnesses or participants in a newsworthy event. So, the story's content is second-hand news and thus a secondary source. If someone who actually took part in the event and wrote a story, that would be a first-hand resource. For example, if a climber who personally climbed Mount Everest wrote an account about the climb and the new equipment used in the process, that would be first-hand news concerning the climb and the evaluation of the equipment. This is a primary source of information. Newspapers usually meet the following criteria: accessibility. Its contents are reasonably accessible to the public. Periodicity. It is published at regular intervals. Currency. Its information is up to date. Universality. It covers a range of topics. Indexing periodicals. In indexing periodicals, the relevant items with full bibliographical details are selected from primary sources and are arranged either under broad subject headings or under class numbers. This arrangement brings all the items on the same subject together. Bibliographical details help the reader to identify and locate the original document. For example, if the document is a journal article, bibliographical details will provide the name or names of the authors, title of the article, title of the journal, its volume number, issue number, year of publication, and the page numbers of the article. The indexing periodicals also provide author and subject indexes of the items covered. On the other hand, abstracting periodicals, here the contents of the selected items are condensed or summarized, called abstracts, along with bibliographical details of the document. Bibliographical details remain the same as that in the indexing periodicals, only an abstract is added to the bibliographical details. At times, a well-prepared abstract serves as substitute for the original document. Abstracting periodicals also provide author and subject indexes. In this module, we have learned that the primary sources are easily identifiable as they are the original sources of any newly generated information. On the other hand, the secondary sources are less easily defined than primary sources. Generally, they are accounts written after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. They are interpretations and evaluations of primary sources. Secondary sources are not evidence, but rather commentary on and discussion of evidence. However, what some define as secondary sources, the others define as a tertiary source, as context is everything. And lastly, the tertiary sources compile or digest other sources of information. Some reference material and textbooks are considered tertiary sources when their chief purpose is to list, summarize, or simply repackage ideas or other information. So, in this particular module, we have studied in detail about the primary, secondary, and tertiary sources of information. The other details, the description, examples, etc., are given in the written part of the module. Thank you very much.